Good evening. We're on the air once again with another edition of Pachios on the News, and my name is Harold Pachios. Welcome, and I always feel that's superfluous because a lot of you watch every month, and we know each other. In the last week, I've run into two people, both in the supermarket. That's where I usually see this audience, so they all eat well, I guess. And we talk, and I think that's the thing I like best about doing this program, is meeting people because of the program and talking to them and learning about them. And I feel it's been a blessing to me to have this opportunity. So tonight, we're going to welcome our guest. It's Anna Trevorrow. She is a member of the Portland City Council, and she used to be on the Portland School Board, chairman of the school board, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I asked her to come on because a lot's happening in our city, a lot about politics. People think that, one group is kind of taken over running the city. I don't think that, but there are people that I know that say, well, they're organized, this one group, and they're taking over the city so that the city government doesn't represent all diversity. It may represent some personal diversity, but it doesn't represent people of different walks of life. I'll ask our guest about that and whether it does or not. Anna, welcome.
Thank you.
You're from Monmouth, Maine.
Yes, yes.
And you have been in Portland now for a few years, and you got here, and did you get immediately active in local politics? You went to USM, right?
I went to USM. I graduated with a BA in English.
English.
And
so you read a lot.
I read a lot.
And wrote.
And I still read and write. I have been in Portland ever since.
So your parents are teachers?
My parents were both public school teachers. They're retired now.
And what did they teach? Tell me what your dad taught and what your mother taught.
My dad taught high school English and was also a lacrosse coach. And my mom taught elementary school, multiple classrooms and age groups.
Great. So that's interesting. You get a real perspective when your parents are public school teachers.
Yeah, I mean, you grow up that way and you're taught that education is the foundation of society and the one thing in life that nobody can take away from you. And I think it was that really inspired me to become active in the community. And so, yeah, I think pretty much from the time of college and getting into Portland, I became interested and active, and I served on the Portland Charter Commission back in 2009. That was my first role in elected office. And then a few years later, in 2013, I got elected to the school board. I served 8 years. I was chair of the finance committee there for many of those years, chair of the board there for 2 years. And then 3 years ago, I was elected to the city council. And I just was appointed this year chair of the finance committee.
Are you the chairman of the finance committee?
Of the finance committee,
Of the
yes.
City of Portland Finance Committee?
Yes.
That's serious stuff. It's a lot of money.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
So, Anna, when you went on the school board, and you were how many? 8 years?
8 years.
What were the big issues that you thought were the most important issues?
When I was on that duration of 8 years, I feel like the board and the district kind of underwent a cultural shift where equity became the sort of laser focus to really try to close the opportunity gap, as it's known, for kids who have a socioeconomic disadvantage. So, we engaged the whole board in our own education around diversity, equity, and inclusion. We underwent a goal-setting exercise and built buy-in from the entire district, and really just became laser focused on helping the kids that were most underserved.
Well, when you say underserved, however, they get a free education. They don't have, maybe they don't have parents who are teachers who help them with their schoolwork, but how are they disadvantaged in school?
Well, I think a lot of what happens outside of school has to be addressed before you are capable of sitting in a classroom and gaining the benefits of an education. So, you know, a lot of kids are food insecure. A lot of kids are in single parent households. There's a constituency of students who are homeless. And we have to kind of compensate for that. So, you know, just as an example, one of the goals of the district was that every child would have, could identify within the district a caring adult in their life. Because we know that having that role model is crucial to educational achievement.
But some of them had a caring adult. They might have been poor, but had a caring adult right at home.
Some of them, yeah, and a lot of them don't.
And a lot of them don't. It's interesting. I interact some with the immigrant community in Portland, mostly Africans. I find them fairly conservative in social outlook. Their view is they come to this country for opportunity, and they know they don't have to have great educations themselves. They know that education is the key in this country. And I find it interesting because it's cultural with them. It's cultural. A lot of them come from small villages where families are extremely important and family values. And they're relatively conservative family values. And they're not accustomed to depending on people outside the family to impart values or to stimulate interests. I find that's true. I don't know. Have you found that at all? That
I think that there are certainly cultural differences between Africa and and the United States in terms of the family dynamic, family roles. I've worked actually fairly recently with asylum seekers. We had last year, actually around this time, we held a forum around homelessness at Ocean Gateway where we invited the community to come and kind of let us know what they were thinking about the issue of homelessness. And there were 4 individual male asylum seekers that showed up there, and they were the only people in the forum who were actually experiencing homelessness. And they spoke through an interpreter. They hadn't learned English yet, and they asked for help. And I began fundraising to get those 4 individuals emergency shelter. And then we worked through the person who was their interpreter that night to help them eventually find longer-term housing and get set up with general assistance. And so they come very determined and ready to start a new life and get on their feet. And they really have to just sort of like work through the barriers of the system through that beginning period of time.
Yeah, and you find some people that just by their very nature, because we're all born differently, different skills, different inclinations, some, I assume, can do it without your help.
I mean, for the non-English speaking asylum seekers that are coming now, I would say it's very, very challenging to be kind of handed a packet of material on general assistance and how to do a self-directed housing search in a city that has a 0% vacancy rate And most of the apartments that are available, they don't qualify for GA because GA only pays a certain amount per, 1 unit or 2 unit, and Portland rents are higher than that.
Rents are higher everywhere. It's not just Portland, Maine.
The places that we were finding were in Lewiston.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but I'm talking about nationally.
Yeah.
It's a
a
crisis
trend.
everywhere.
Yep.
So, but back to the schools. One size I think doesn't fit all. My father came to this country when he was 9 years old from a small village in the mountains of southern Greece. Didn't have much of an education. Didn't speak a word of English. Came with his parents. Bridgeport, Connecticut. Went to school. He was 9 years old. Put him in first grade because he didn't speak the language.
Right.
But as he told me, get on the playground every day. Within a couple, 2 or 3 weeks, he was speaking, and within a month, he was speaking for his parents, who were having a harder time learning the language. And so, assimilation is also a natural inclination for people. I'm not saying one size doesn't fit all, but I'm saying that some kids are able to do it. If you look at, I read about the people who are in the top 10 of the class at Deering or Portland or South Portland. A lot of them with African names, a lot of them with Asian names. Immigrant kids whose parents understood this is a place for opportunity if you get educated, and they're making damn sure their kids get educated.
Yeah.
Some don't have that. Not just immigrant kids. Some kids whose families have been here for 10 generations in Maine.
Right.
They don't have that. So I think it's not just it's not one set of people with certain characteristics. Everybody's different.
That's right.
And
I think it's an economic disadvantage, I think, that tends to correlate with the challenges and barriers to achievement in schools.
it's true, yeah, and we have to worry about that. On the other hand, I think it's fair to recognize that not everybody with economic obstacles, not every child with economic obstacles can't get over the obstacles.
Right.
And we know just what I'm talking about, kids who are valedictorians who've been in this country 7 or 8 years, came as children, and here they are at the top of their class. So it's because we're all different. Some people who have been in this country, as they say, for 10 generations, don't do well in our society, where others who have been here a half a generation do. And we have to worry about everybody, but we can't we can't assume that every single person needs the same thing. They all need different
Right.
things.
Yeah.
So, at the school board, well, you had a problem in the school board. What was it? It was a finance problem. It was the superintendent. People didn't get paid or something. Tell me about that.
That was after
That was when you were in the council.
right. And it had to do, I don't know all the ins and outs of it because
Yeah.
I wasn't on the board at the time, but I think it had to do with having a complicated payroll software and a limited amount of employees that were trained in how to do it,
Yeah.
such that when somebody went on leave, the whole system kind of broke down. Yeah.
So, what other? I mean, the city. So your interest obviously is, yes. We chatted a little bit before we began the program, and you said you were brought up in a family where there was a sense of social responsibility we're kind of all in this together and we got to look after each other.
Yes.
And that's informed your life.
Yes.
And it's good we have people like you around.
Thank you.
Because we have others who are not as interested, some maybe who are more interested, but others who are not as interested. And then we have a group of people who say, you know, I'm not interested in that. So you know about that. I mean, you read a lot, so you know there's people that have no interest in that. But we always have people in our society who do have an interest in it, and they're the people that work in nonprofits and take care of others, and it's very important. And it annoys some people on the right. You know, they say, well, virtue signalers. And they get annoyed, and I don't know why they're annoyed. So just relax. You don't have to do it, but there are people who want to do it, so let them help. Doesn't hurt you.
Right.
So I never quite understood why they get so annoyed with people who want to help. And they say, well, makes them feel as though they're superior. So what? If it makes them feel that way, how's that hurt you? How's that damage you? It doesn't. So we've always had, forever, human beings, certain human beings have kind of been put on this earth to worry about others and help them. Teachers are an example. They, you know, they don't make much money,
Right.
but they're trying to help.
Right.
So, on the council, some people, I talked to people, preparing for the show a little bit. So one person said to me, you know, I think this city council and the new group, this person assumes that a group took over city government. I'm not sure that's true. The mayor's not in your group. So, you would agree with that?
I think that there is a narrative that the council is a majority progressive.
Yeah.
And I think that that's probably true.
Yeah.
I think, you know, Portland is sort of a unique city where the political spectrum, instead of being like from conservative to liberal, it's more like sort of, you know,
moderate
to progressive.
Yeah.
And I would say the majority of the councilors are closer to the progressive, and I would count myself in that camp.
Yeah.
But interestingly, I mean, if you were to analyze our votes, we don't always vote the same way.
Yeah.
And I think that the narrative part of it is this idea that we're kind of organized or have some kind of agenda. That certainly is not my experience.
I find that very, very interesting, because that is contrary to the narrative.
Right.
And you're saying, and you're experiencing it, you don't all vote the same way.
Correct.
You may label yourselves as progressives, but you have different views on different issues.
Right. And that's what's interesting about city issues. I feel like, you know, at the state level, the policies that they vote on are much more, there's less gray area. It's you know, either that's, you know, there's a liberal vote and there's a conservative vote. At the city level, there's much more gray area. It's much more nuanced. It's hard to delineate, like, what is the progressive versus moderate stance on, you know, the budget, or, you know, a project to fix the roads.
Well,
or,
people
you know.
think the progressives don't worry about the budget. They don't worry about property taxes.
Yeah.
Is that true?
I think that perhaps the progressives have a slightly higher tolerance for an increase in the tax rate.
Well, the
property
increase
taxes.
is every year. It's the amount.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And like this year, we ended up between the schools and the city with a 5% tax increase. And in my experience over the years, that's a little bit on the high side of what it's been, but it's not unheard of. And I mean, my experience is going back a decade. So I think that even though, you know, progressives are the majority, we're still ending up in a very similar place.
Would you think that the progressives are the majority of the voters in Portland, or it's hard to know?
I think that they are, and particularly in an election year that is a larger voter turnout.
That the number, when they get into the larger numbers, that it's more of a progressive vote.
Yeah.
Well, what about, I've often thought of this, Portland is also a city of neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a lot of people, including many blue-collar workers, who traditionally have owned their own homes in their neighborhoods. And so they go to work, they have to pay the mortgage, they have to pay the bills, and they have to pay the property taxes. And DEI isn't so important to them. It's paying the bills and getting their kids educated. That's important to them. Are their concerns kind of outside the progressive agenda?
You know, my feeling on this issue is that we have sort of a fundamental flaw in our property taxation system, because unlike income taxes, which are bracketed so that the higher earners pay a higher percentage, and so you can effect sort of equitable taxation that way and collect more revenue where it exists. Property taxes have to be applied at a flat tax across the board.
Well, they have to be, under the Constitution, they have to be equal.
Right.
So if you have a piece of property that's going to be taxed and it's worth $100,000, you can't say to somebody else, yours is worth $100,000, we're going to charge you twice as much. Because who's making that judgment?
Right. I mean, the courts have ruled that you have to apply that equal means one tax rate. So I've actually put on the agenda for this year for the Finance Committee to review a couple of kind of creative ways, I think, that we could potentially affect revenue collection, and in a way that would help people who can't afford it as well as others that can.
Well, who decides whether they can afford it as well?
Well, I think it depends on their income.
But it's hard, but it depends on their income.
Right, so through like a rebate system, like the state has a program where if your income is a certain percentage of your housing expense, then you qualify for a rebate. And we have a program at the city level that mirrors that, but it applies only to seniors. So I've put on the agenda to look at what would it look like to expand that so that it was purely based on income, so that it applied to everybody who qualifies for the state program.
So one of the economists talk about the notion of elasticity when it comes to taxes. That you can raise the tax and raise the tax and raise the tax, and then at a certain point, people break with it and say, we're walking, we're leaving, because it's a mobile society. So elasticity means, we can raise the tax level to X amount, and that won't break the system. But if you raise it to X plus 1, then you have diminishing returns. Is that something that what do you think of that? Because you may think, well, that I don't care about that.
I mean, that's an economic theory, and I'm not an economist. But I think that through policies like the one I just talked about, perhaps there's a way that we can protect the people who need protection, and capture the revenue in the areas where revenue exists and wealth exists.
But one time I was up at City Hall for something. I was listening to some debate, and there was a big crowd up there. I forget what the issue was. And some young man got up and said, we got to do something to stop these developers from coming to town. And you have that feeling sometimes we got to stop the developers from coming to Portland?
I think that Portland, as we've talked about, is becoming less affordable. And there's a perception out there, I think, that the kind of high-end condos, these new developments are a driving force of unaffordability.
They're a driving force of unaffordability?
I think that is a perception. I'm not sure that I agree with it. I think we do need housing at all levels of affordability. And
I would agree with that.
yeah, and we have suffered from a deficit of housing development for.
We're going to get into that. I'm glad you raised that, because we're going to talk about affordable housing.
Right. Yeah.
So, but just to complete this subject of developers, so this guy was complaining about the developers, and I chatted with him afterwards. This was maybe 10 years ago. I said, look out the window. We were on the second floor of the city hall. See all these buildings? That's what fuels state government. I mean, city government.
That's true.
That's where the money comes from.
Right.
You want to get rid of them? Dry up your funding source. There's room for everybody, including people who take risks, financial risks, and produce things that are good for society. And so I was taken back by that kid. I thought, Jesus, he's one-dimensional, doesn't understand things. Economics is a social science. It's the study of human reaction, of human behavior. That's what it's all about. So it does affect human behavior. Now let's go to affordable housing. What do you think we can do about affordable housing, other than telling people, capping rents, telling them you can't raise your rent or whatever?
Well, I mean, I think that we need more affordable housing, and
we do.
They are typically, partnerships. There are affordable housing developers. The city does what they can to contribute to those projects. We have a fund. It's named after former councilor Jill Doosan, the Jill Doosan Housing Trust Fund, that is available for developers to apply for. So that's oftentimes a place where you can kind of utilize some capital from the city. But I think we need more of it. And the city's role, as we often say, it's creating the conditions for development. It's hard for the city as an entity to be a developer.
Cities don't do it very well. They get into the particular residential development. They used to do that in communist countries, these big yellow buildings, big blocks that depressed everybody that was living in them. But you mentioned something that I think is interesting, and people watching find it interesting. There are people in the affordable residential business. And the way it works, though, is they have to go to a bank, they have to get loans, they have to be at risk. If it doesn't work out and they go broke, that's it.
There's a lot of pieces that have to come together.
There are a lot of pieces that have to come together, but the only way it works, because labor, to build anything is very expensive these days. The cost of construction is out of sight. Secondly, interest rates are very high. So both of those things militate against new construction. But what the government has done in the last 50 years is to induce people to build this. And how do they induce them? Grease their palms. It's capitalism. They have to get them to do it, and they do. The Section 8 housing program took off in the United States in the 1970s and 80s because people could make money doing it. So they took risks.
Yeah.
They went to the bank, borrowed money, signed their names because the government created conditions where they could make money. So I think the government has to participate in it.
Yeah.
The only way it can happen. And so in Portland, we have very high construction costs, very high. We can build the housing, but you got to grease people who know how to do it and are willing to take the risk. You got to grease their palm. You agree with that?
I do.
Yeah.
I do. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't love capitalism,
No,
but I
I
recognize
can
that
tell.
as a municipality, there's little control we have over that. We have to exist within it, and so yeah, these are capitalist concepts.
So we're not going to get into the big debate for capitalism and socialism and so forth. But I'm old, so I've been a lot of places, and I've spent a lot of time when there was an Iron Curtain, not a lot of time, but some time behind the Iron Curtain. And I have been to the Czech Republic, it was Czechoslovakia at the time, Poland, and Russia. I made my first trip to Russia in 1970, which was at the height of the Cold War. And it was some depressing place, I'll tell you, without the capitalists. I'm going to add that's my editorial comment. It was some depressing place without the capitalists. Everything was the same. Everything was by the government. All just cookie cutter, drab. There wasn't even a neon light in Moscow. Why? Who cared? There was no private business. No one cared whether you had any business. You go in a restaurant's run by some government bureaucrat. Think that government bureaucrat cared whether anybody came in that restaurant? He worked for the government.
Right.
So there's a balance. One of the things, we're on this kind of big subject here of progressive and moderate and the extremes. You and I talked about this briefly on the phone. The extremes of the right and the left sometimes have the same tactics. The far out on both sides, same tactics. The people that I know on the right, when I tell them, this is just like, you don't like the libs, but the people on the extreme left act like you do, I say to these people on the right, and they do. Same tactics. So the one thing that has stuck with me, one thing more than anything else that has stuck with me, is a program I was watching on public television 40, 50 years ago. And it was a program about a summer music camp in Puerto Rico with terrific young musicians, set up by Pablo Casals, the famous cellist.
Yeah, okay.
And Casals was directing these kids in an orchestral piece. And he banged his baton and he said, "Stop." And he said, of course he has a Spanish accent. And he said, "You must understand, good music is like good government." He said, you have to have some moderation. You can't go too far in one direction or the other. You have to have some stability, he said. Stability, somewhere closer to the center. And if you want to make good music. And I've never forgotten that. Not everybody would agree with me or Casals, but that is another way to view it. I want you to be candid with me. You say, look, Carol, I don't agree with you.
Well, I think that the question that raises for me is what does moderate mean these days? You know, I feel like we live in a political world of extremes,
Yeah.
and my goal in serving in elected office has always been to rule with the principle of humanity. And that to me doesn't fall left or right. That's just a core value that I think is most important to like the longevity of the species. So
How does it, okay, but
I think that we get into the polarities.
yeah.
The harm in the extremism is in the narratives that they create. They kind of manipulate facts in order to create a narrative that is harmful to both sides.
And do you think both sides sometimes
I
create
think
these
sometimes
narratives?
Sure. I think they do. I think you know, there are narratives on both sides, and both sides can be aggressive. I also think that people who identify as moderate create narratives that can be harmful.
Well, give me an example of that.
Well, geez, an example of that.
Well, you don't have to give.
I think that, let me think. I feel that Portland, while it is a liberal city, liberalism is not immune from subconscious bias. And I think that in Portland, when we identify as liberal, we believe in diversity, we believe in equality, we believe in all these principles that are shared. But when we are confronted with policies that seem to challenge our own privilege, we react in opposition. And that,
So long as it doesn't affect me, they think, right?
right. If, you know, I have compassion for homelessness, but when they're across the street in my park, maybe I don't anymore. So, and that,
Maybe you do, but don't impact me negatively.
I think that is the function of subconscious bias.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about homelessness, because I first read about you when you and, is it Rodriguez?
Yes.
Councilor Rodriguez proposed an ordinance to ban or to prohibit the city from, what do they call it, sweeping
Right.
the encampments.
It was a proposal to put a moratorium on sweeping through the winter.
Yeah. You want them to stay outside all winter?
I believed that the forcible evictions created more harm than good.
You did?
I did.
But then they all went inside and slept inside for the rest of the winter.
When it became cold enough and we had enough beds, more of them took shelter.
Yeah. But your moratorium would have kept them outside.
I don't think that I don't think that that's the case.
Okay.
The moratorium, the intent behind the moratorium was only to prohibit these mass evictions that were happening. And you know, the encampments grew so large because we were living by this policy where in order to evict people from living outside, we had to have available shelter beds, or we had to declare the area as an emphasis area, which meant that it had met a certain standard of public health and safety concern. And so we were declaring all of these areas emphasis areas, and at that point people couldn't return to them, so they were pushed into smaller and smaller spaces. The encampments grew larger and larger. So the idea was, if we if we didn't have these emphasis areas, they could remain in small, in smaller groups that would be less impactful on any, one neighborhood. So that's what we were trying to do. And the other thing is that there is a certain portion of the unhoused population for which the shelters were just not attainable.
And you want to describe for the audience why they didn't like the shelters?
We talk about it in terms of barriers to accessing shelter. And the city collected some data around that, asking people why you turn down an available bed. And the number one reason was loss of autonomy. And what that means, it's sort of a politically correct way of saying that this institution, a 208 bed or more shelter, doesn't comport to an individual lifestyle. Now that may be addiction. It may be that you have a job that doesn't allow you to get back to the shelter before curfew.
But wouldn't you assume there are drawbacks to everything? Mm-hmm. I've been lucky in life, but there are drawbacks to some of the things that I want to do. And I remember, loss of autonomy. I remember I went to law school at night, 4 years at mm-hmm. night. And I remember weekends when I worked all week long. So on weekends, I had to start reading cases all the time. I worked reading books, law books, all weekend. And I lived in an apartment house where there was a pool. And all these young people were down there having a good time. And I wanted to be down there. That's called autonomy. If I had autonomy, I'd have gone down there. But it was self-imposed on me. I decided that this is what I want to do. So you don't always get to do everything you want.
But I think that implicit in that, though, is an assumption that addiction is a choice. I think it's, recognized by the federal government as a disease. And so this is a real thing that prevents people from being able to access shelter.
Well, alcoholism is a choice too, right? Not a choice. That's a disease too, right?
It is.
Okay, that's a disease too. So, but that sometimes some people can do something about it, and sometimes people just fail. They try and they fail. Mm-hmm. But so it's also a choice to try to do something about it.
It is. And, I think the health community would talk about it in terms of a disease that is treated versus one that's in recession. Or
one
remission.
That's what?
In remission, sorry, yeah.
They get a lot of terms.
You can have a judgment about it. But
I know a lot of people who had trouble with alcohol mm-hmm. who don't anymore. Mm-hmm. And I know people who've had trouble with alcohol who still do.
Right.
But I don't, again, one size doesn't fit all.
Right.
You can't generalize.
Right, exactly. And that's why, one institution doesn't fit all either.
Well, when you say one institution, one thing about institutions is that was the government stepping forward and saying, we got to make sure that these people have a bed, shelter, food, medicine, and for people mentally ill, medical treatment. Mm-hmm. Now, some people might not have liked that. Mm-hmm. Some people don't like it. I don't know, but I read newspaper articles about the homeless encampments in Portland and interviews with homeless people who said, no, I don't want to go to the shelter. My boyfriend and I are here, or, you can't have drugs in the shelter. They don't allow drugs. Yeah. And there are drawbacks to a lot of things in life. Mm-hmm. When you say autonomy, what I worry about You just said people should be able to do whatever they want.
Well, I think that the process for getting someone to ultimately accept shelter is a longer process of social work and developing relationships through outreach work, as opposed to a mass eviction of an encampment. There's some portion of those people who are not going to land in the shelter.
Yeah, I understand you. I understand you, and I'm listening to you, and I'm learning. But I want those people watching to know. I think it's cruel to create a system that allows those people, many of whom, large numbers of whom, are unable to help themselves very much because they are afflicted with mental illness or drug addiction, and that impairs people's ability to do things for themselves. It impairs their ability.
Right, and we need.
Who's going to do?
We need a solution.
How can you depend on them to make the decision?
They're not going to end up in the shelter no matter what, though. There's a small amount of people who are just not going to fit that model, and we need something that fits them.
Well, why do we need it? If there's an option for them, and it's not perfect because none of us have perfect options for everything in our lives, why, if I'm in a certain circumstance, I have to do things? You know, I was in the Navy. A lot of stuff I didn't like doing, but those were my circumstances, so I did them. Mm-hmm. And that happens in life. You can't do just whatever you feel like doing all the time.
But I think it's not just whatever you feel like doing. It's a condition that they don't really have the choice.
No, they don't, and many of them impaired and can't help themselves. Mm-hmm. They are incapable. Who's going to help them if they can't help themselves? Are you going to help them? No, seriously. If somebody, there are people who can't help themselves.
There are.
So who's going to help them? Shouldn't the government come and make certain decisions to say, hey, look, we can't let these people kill themselves. We can't let these people just die out in the cold. We have to do something about it. We have to care about them.
But that's not what our laws do. Our laws protect individuals
Sometimes you protect them by doing for them what they can't do.
Okay, but that's not what we're doing.
Well, you're right about that. And we discussed on the phone deinstitutionalization.
Right.
And we agreed that when that occurred, there was supposed to be something government-sponsored to take its place, which were smaller group homes where they would get, a bed, a warm room, mm-hmm. Medical treatment, drug addiction treatment, all of these things, and the government never came through and did that.
Right.
But there are people who, based on what you said, and I think you're right, who say, wait a minute, I want my autonomy. I don't want to go to that group home. I don't want to be treated by a doctor. I don't want to stop my addiction. And I have autonomy the way I'm living now.
I think if we had more group homes, we would have ability to diversify the populations that those group homes served. I mean, I think we need more, quite frankly, no barrier shelters. If we're truly
I don't know what a no barrier shelter is.
A shelter that is able to accommodate people who are in active addiction.
Well, what would that do to the people who don't want to be addicts in the shelter?
Well, that's why a smaller shelter model might work better, like group homes, because you could cater to different populations.
Yeah. You would agree, but we're having a nice little debate here, but the people who, there are people who are afflicted with mental illness. Mm-hmm. When I was growing up, they were in institutions. Mm-hmm. Some of them content, some of them discontent, but some of them content. Mm-hmm. and now they're on the street
Right.
looking after themselves, and some are able to manage and some are not. So, and when I say manage taking care of themselves. But they have. You have to worry about the people. If you want to put others with them, you're going to affect people who don't want to smoke, who don't want to inject themselves with drugs, who don't want to be
Right.
subjected to all these things, and you want them to live together. You want to make sure that they live together.
Well, so what I'm saying is, if we all of a sudden tomorrow came through with that funding for group homes, they're smaller in scale, and so you could diversify the populations that they serve individually, so that you wouldn't have you.
Well, you couldn't. Let me ask you this. That's true, but wouldn't you prefer, rather than diversifying the populations, wouldn't you prefer that if we're going to spend a lot of money on these group homes, that they be spread out all over the state? Wouldn't you prefer that some of them be built in Aroostook County, because some of the people who are homeless and are mentally ill and afflicted with drug addiction live up there and don't want to
Yeah.
come to Portland?
Yeah, I agree that people need to be met where they are.
Yeah.
Certainly, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
so
yeah.
there's only so much money you have to make choices with resources.
Right.
There's resources, only are limited somehow. And so we can't have everything that would be perfect. And that's why there were these big institutions, because that's what we had resources to do. But now they're on the street, and now they're sleeping outside in the freezing rain and sleet. And we have a society where some people, not saying you, but think that's okay, they're at least free. They're free human beings
Yeah.
to
And
live the way they want.
I think that it's not that anybody believes that that's the best way to live, but when we closed down the large institutions back in the 70s and 80s, we granted rights to people who were not able to care for themselves, and those rights still exist today.
Was that a good idea?
Well, I think that people who are suffering schizophrenia, for example, it's definitely not the best case scenario that they're living outside by themselves. But
Would they be better
don't-
off in an institution?
I think we need some option for them. But they're not making it into the institution that we have currently.
Well, we don't have many institutions because people don't like institutions, because they think it takes away people's freedom.
Right. Well, we have the 250-bed shelter.
We have a
on
250-bed
Riverside.
shelter, and city makes an effort to give people a place to stay out of the weather and to be warm. There are a lot of organizations feeding people, so there's a lot being done, and sometimes you have to do it as a group, because you can't just say, okay, here's 50 people, they're all got some affliction or another, and we're going to each treat them individually with respect. So we respect them, so we're going to each treat them, in a customized way. Don't have the resources. It's unfortunate.
It is unfortunate.
Yeah,
And
and I can tell you're sad.
But it's going to leave people out of the system.
So what's your solution?
Well, I mean,
You want to help these
This-
people. What if you were the queen and you were in
I mean,
charge
I
of all
think-
the resources? What would you
I
do?
think we need more resources from the federal government, and we need greater collaboration regionally and statewide. But I do think that a model of smaller shelters to supplement what we have, smaller and more individualized shelters, would go a long way to being able to meet people where they are with the needs that they have.
So where are we going to get the resources? From the federal government?
I mean, I think this is a national epidemic, homelessness.
Yes.
The resources have to come from the federal level. And, you know, I, as one individual, a city councilor from District 1, am not the person that has that magic wand that's going to fix homelessness. But if we collectively as a society want to fix homelessness, it has to be at the national level.
And this group home concept that we've been talking about is a start.
I think so, yeah, a start.
And if people reject, if any individuals reject it, say, not for me, I'm not, you don't fence me in.
Yeah, I think they need intensive social work. They need connection to agencies that can figure out what is going to work for this person and how do we kind of coax them indoors over time.
That's 600,
Yeah.
they've claimed
I mean,
685,000 homeless in the United States.
We're not talking small potatoes. It does take resources, it does.
So, you know, we've debated some of these. You could see that you and I don't always share the same view, but sometimes we do. Sometimes we do.
Sometimes, yeah.
Yeah, and I must say I've enjoyed talking to you very much because
Thank you. Likewise.
you're honest.
Thank you.
You're honest, and you're pleasant, and you're a nice person, and I would say to those on the right, including some of my friends who might be watching, keep that in mind, that people who have a different view than you do, and clearly that I do on some things, are decent people trying to do good, trying to do what they think is best. And so there's something we can learn, and one of the reasons I wanted you on the show. You know, basically, you know what it was? I want to find out what makes this woman tick. That's what we've been doing. So thank you very much for coming. I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate it
You
too.
were great.
This was fun.
Thanks very much.